Is the question.
Why is Yaakov's death recorded before he dies, and it's as opposed to Avram and Sarah, for example, they were his years, and then they were buried. And here there's a whole parsha of brachos to the sons uh, after his years of how many years he lived.
Okay. Now, we had mentioned that initially Yaakov was meant to live 180 years. And for whatever reason, based on different midrashim, he had 33 years taken from his life. If Yaakov would have lived an additional 33 years in Mitzrayim, because as it says, the parsha is called Parsha Stuma, that the bondage at the most infinitesimal level did not begin until Yaakov passed away. As long as Yaakov was alive, he created an insular spiritual environment as if they were not in Egypt. The moment he passed away, we had this spiritual seepage of this purity started to compromise Klal Yisrael. If he would have been there another 33 years, it would have been another dimension. Klal Yisrael would have, after 210 years, would have been a different level. Maybe the bondage wouldn't have manifested itself the way it did. And maybe we wouldn't have even become idolaters. By the end of 210, we were the Jews we became pagans. The only tribe remained unscathed was Shevet Levi. They're the only ones. But all the others, well, that's every member of every tribe, but basically they were all compromised in this very serious way. Now, the Rechaim HaKadosh speaks about, he lived so many years, then says, Vayikruvu Yimei Yisrael Lomus. Yisrael, it was Yisrael. We mentioned whenever we speak about, we use the appellation of Yisrael, it's always Yaakov at that moment is addressing the destiny of the Klal Yisrael, the spiritual status of Klal Yisrael. Yaakov is the biological father, so to say, relative to Yisrael. So now he asks a question, how did Yaakov know that he was nearing death? He wasn't. It only says later that it was told to Yosef that his father was not well. Right now, he's fully functional, very well. How did Yaakov know that his days are nearing, that he's going to pass away soon? Therefore, he's summoning his son Yosef. How did he know this? So he says something very interesting, Dor Chaim HaKadosh, based on Psukim, and he says it's based on the Zohar that every person, when you're born with certain sparks of spirituality, and every day one has an obligation or an opportunity to perfect that spark. And these sparks are in one's neshama. Every day we live, if we address that spark is invigorated, infused with kedusha through one service of Hashem, and that spark detaches itself from the neshama, ascends to the world to come. What happens if the person did not address that spark? Even if he didn't sin, but he did not infuse it with the study of Torah, doing mitzvahs, the spark detaches itself and it has no value. And every day this happens. He says, you find people that throughout their lifetime, they were very capable. And when they get older, they become slightly feeble. Why do they become feeble? Because the sparks that are part of the vibrancy of one's personality in the neshama, it's not Alzheimer's. But the sharpness and the vibrancy and the intensity of the personality is not there any longer. Because these sparks have been expended. He says something interesting. He says, person does tshuva, Hashem allows the sparks to come back, the sparks that were not enriched with Kedusha, they come back, and you're able to address the sparks, and they could be reinfused, although they already were expended, they left in the neshama. He says, you find very often that a person, he's at the end of his life, nearly comatose, and all of a sudden, the last moment, he becomes fully alive. And everybody believes he's recovered and he's going to live on. And then an hour later, the person dies. Because he says before, it's based on the pasuk that before a person dies, all the sparks of a person's life come back to the neshama, and therefore the person has a full appearance of full function. He's fully functioning. But it's that, as they say, it's the last hurrah, so to say, and then the person totally peters out and the person dies. Yaakov was at a level that he sensed within himself that the majority of the sparks that he had in his neshama were already expended. And therefore, at this moment, it was the ultimate moment he had to address. Every moment before he passed away, even before he became ill, he had to address what he had to address. The Yikru Yisrael Lomos, that alerted him. He has to summon Yosef to guarantee he's not going to be buried in Egypt. He has to bless his grandchildren, Ephraim and Menashe. He has to summon his sons, and he has to give them the bracha, which will determine the destiny of Klal Yisrael. So that's the reason why he lived so many years, and as a result of that, as they say, the time is of the essence, and he had the sense. As a result of that, he had to act as he did at that particular moment. That's the Orach Chaim just in Vayikru Yisrael Lomos. Some say, with that, I understand. Therefore, it starts to tell me how many years he lived in Egypt, and he had the sense of how much more time he had. Therefore, he had to act as he acted at that particular moment. Orach Chaim, at the end of Bereshis, speaks about that before the Mabul, people lived 900 years, 800 years, very lengthy lives. After the Mabul, after the Great Flood, the lifespan of people was relatively maybe a tenth of that original lifespan, maybe less. Why? So he says something interesting. Of every person that comes to this world comes with a mission. What's the mission? You're endowed with the neshama, and based on the challenges that you're given in this world, you must perfect that neshama to achieve what we call shleimus, to achieve perfection within that neshama. Once you've achieved that, it's time for the neshama to depart. And a person is given now, if a person has an objective and a mission, he has to be given sufficient time to address that mission and that objective. So let's say a person's endowed with a mega soul, and it takes 850 years to achieve that level of perfection. Hashem has to give that person 850 years, because anything less than that, you're not going to be able to address what has to be addressed to perfect that neshama. He says, pre-Great Flood, the neshamas that people were endowed with were mega neshamas. And it took that many years, they needed that many years to address whatever had to be addressed. But you realize from get-go till the final moment, it's endless amount of time. So people, they get waylaid, they get distracted, and ultimately they fail. Very few people keep the eye on the ball this extended period of time to address, understand that you can't procrastinate. You just can't push it off. But you say, well, I have another 800 years to live. But the majority of people failed. So what did Hashem do? After the Great Flood, he took that mega soul and he broke it into 8 pieces, into 10 pieces. And he endowed 10 different pieces, 10 different people with a piece of that neshama. So people afterwards were only a tenth of what they originally were. So how many years do you need? You only get as many years as you need to address the challenges that the neshama needs to achieve perfection. That's why after the Great Flood, so from day one till the conclusion of one's life, the end is closer to the beginning. So one is able to sense the times of the essence. But even then, it's not simple. People have short memories. We procrastinate. Tomorrow. Even if you're doing well, it's tomorrow. We put things off. And that's the challenge of life. To feel the urgency of life, that every moment has infinite value, and to make the right choice and invest it properly. That's the understanding. Here we're talking about Yaakov is going to determine and address the objective of creation, Klal Yisrael. His bracha to his children are essential. At what level are they going to address that objective? And what are we going to achieve? At what level are they going to be when we come to Kabbalah Satorah? And even beyond Kabbalah Satorah, what is that spiritual capacity? That capacity is determined by the brachos that Yaakov gives to his children, because that confirms and actualizes, gives them ability to evolve as they're meant to evolve. And that's based on the bracha. Say Moshe Rabbeinu Shokol connected Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama. Could you imagine? With 600,000 people, men above the age of 20. That was the critical mass we need to Kabbalah Satorah. Moshe Rabbeinu personally, his neshama was the equivalent of Klal Yisrael. He was endowed with that mega neshama. The only reason why Moshe Rabbeinu was the only one qualified to receive the Torah at Sinai, the only one, is that the Torah had to be given to the equivalent of Klal Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu had a neshama, in terms of its dimension, was the equivalent of Klal Yisrael. Therefore, only he could be the conduit that through him, the Torah is going to be transferred to Klal Yisrael for that reason. Anyone else did not have that capacity. So Moshe had that in the neshama, although Moshe lived only 120 years. But he was able to achieve in 120 years what it took in the early years, 950 years or 960 years to achieve. And he achieved more than they achieved. Okay, good.
How are we to understand the participation of Yaakov in the endowment of his children's souls when they should? I thought
Okay.
they would 100% come from Hashem.
They do, 100% they come from Hashem. Now, a parent has a child. We all have children. Each child is born to another parent. Family has certain children. The children that are born to that family are born with certain souls, which children born to another family don't have the same souls. When I say the same, they have Jewish souls if they're Jewish. But each soul has a different potential, and that child is born to that family because that parent is the one where that soul has to evolve or develop and be mentored or be influenced by the mother and the father. That's why that soul is put into that family, not into another family. Because what that soul needs in terms of its challenges, God picks the family in which family that soul finds itself. Because only then, but the soul has a potential. To address the potential of that soul, it needs the various experiences, the influences, and the mentoring of the parents. Whether the parents succeed or fail, well, that's part of the challenge. Even if parents do not offer or are involved, but that's part of the challenge of that soul. Now the soul afterwards has to take certain initiatives to be able to address it. That's part of the challenge. Only God knows why one soul, you have one person born to a very devout family where the parents are on the up and up and proficient and understand, and they take care of that soul like the most precious object in existence. Another family, they have no inkling exactly what it's all about. And that child evolves in that family. It's a totally different challenge. Because that soul, the spiritual identity and profile of that soul has a different type of profile, therefore needs different kinds of challenges. Yaakov's children had the most special souls born to existence. Because he was able to achieve in himself, therefore he merited, he should bring those special souls into existence through the matriarchs and the wives he had, Bilhah and Zilpah. Part of his mentoring and is impacting them, affecting them, was based on the bracha he gave them. That bracha will enable them and allow them to be able to have abilities that whatever is innate in their neshamos to address those challenges. But in the DNA, spiritual DNA of that neshama, it was there. The bracha only activated and actualized whatever that DNA was to evolve, to be able for them to make choices, to be who they're supposed to be in each of their capacities. Everything's predestined except Tzaddik V'Rosho. Meaning how brilliant you're going to be, your physicality, how wealthy, how poor, whatever, that's all predestined. But Tzaddik V'Rosho, that's not predestined. That's up to each one of us. Whether it's the parent, whether it's the child, every person has that ability to chart his own course. Okay.
Rabbi, just to get back,
When Hashem created Adam, he says the fruit of his tree would have been pure. But when he ate of the Eitz Hadas, which is a representation of Tov v'Ra, that evil intermingled into his being, and therefore the fruit he produced was already tinged with what? With Ra. The tree was no longer a pure tree. That tree was producing impure fruit. Yaakov, when he was born, after Avram and Yitzchak, his tree was a pure tree. Therefore, the fruit he produced of that tree he had the potential initially to produce that pure fruit. I mean, we all were subject to the evil inclination. We're still post-sin of Adam. But in terms of the fruit, the potential that fruit is able to achieve is literally pure fruit. As a result of that, he was able to father the 12 tribes because he was at that special level, because his tree was a pure tree, didn't have that impurity as Avram had and as Yitzchak had. And therefore, he was able to father the Shiftei Koh, which ultimately were the ones who were the location or the ones who brought Hashem's glory to this existence with Kabbalah Satorah. After whatever had the events that happened, it was told to Yaakov, your father is sick, choler, he's not well. Now, we'd mentioned that the first human being to be subject to illness was Yaakov Avinu. And Yaakov Avinu prayed for this. Why did he pray that there should be illness in existence? Because a person, before he passes away, at one time, we once mentioned Rabbi Akiva Eiger in Brochos cites a Pirkei Rebbe Lezer, when a person sneezes, in every culture, what does one say? One says Gesundheit. One says Asisu, which is an Aramaic word. You should be healed. God bless you. Why? Why does one say when one sneezes, one responds with this like blessing? Why? So the Pirkei Rebbe Lezer explains, Rabbi Akiva Eiger in Brochos cites this Pirkei Rebbe Lezer, because initially, when Hashem created Adam, how did he become a living species? It says, Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. He blew into his nostrils a soul of life. It says the soul entered through the nostrils. When it was time for a person to die, he would sneeze, and when he sneezed, his soul went out through his nostrils. As it entered through the nostrils, it exited through the nostrils. So sneezing was always an indication of death. Then things changed. No longer. So what happened until that time? A person didn't know he was going to die until that last moment happened. Until Avram became a widower, there was no such thing as a person aging. Avram Zokim Baba Yomim is the first time aging is mentioned in Torah. Avram asked that the aging process should take place, but there was no illness. Yaakov has illness, because once there's illness, the person begins to feel infirm and not well, he knows the end is not too far off. To be able to set your house in order before you leave this world. So when Yosef knew there was no such thing as illness until this moment, when he heard his father was sick, he knew this is an indication he better go take the brachos. That means it only happened because his father wanted it, and Hashem gave him his request to be able to set his house in order, to be able to bless his children before he dies. So when it was said to Yosef, immediately he took his two sons to receive the bracha for that reason. Now, we've mentioned this many times. In Hebrew, there are two words which mean the same thing, but it has a totally different connotation. What is the meaning of the word ito in Hebrew? With him. Imo is with him. So what's the difference in ito, imo? Right? We discussed this in the past. Whenever the word es, remember we mentioned, the Mishnah tells us that Shimon Amsuni, he interpreted every es in the Torah. The word es is always an adjunct to what's associated with. Es Hashem Elokech Latiro. Right? That was the one why he wanted initially retract, and he believed that everything was mistaken. Till Reb Kiva says to him, no. He originally says, as I received reward for the interpretation, now acknowledging that I made a mistake, I'm willing to retract everything. Reb Kiva says, not so fast. Es Hashem Elokech Latiro, es, the adjunct, the Rabbis Talmid Chachomim. Hashem wants you to revere the Talmud Chacham as he wants you to revere him. That's the es. Es is always secondary. You find that when Noah's children went into the Teva, why were they saved? Because they were the sons of Noah. They were Ito. They went Ito. They were secondary to him. We pointed out when Lot went to Egypt, he went Ito. He went with Avram. When he came back a wealthy man, he came back Imo. He felt he was of equal status. Therefore, he could contend. I could disagree with you. And that's when the quarrel happened between the shepherds of Avram and the shepherds of Lot, because he was of equal footing. We read in last week's parsha, it's very important. Yaakov, when he went to Egypt, how old was he? He was 130 years old. And who went with him? 70 individuals. Besides, including Yosef and his two children already were in Egypt. A man 130, and he says his children and his grandchildren. And we know how careful the Torah is with not to expend one extra word or an extra letter. So it identifies all the people. Second, let me take it off. Okay. This is when Yaakov's coming to Egypt. They took all their livestock and all their possessions that they amassed in Canaan. Yaakov v'chol zaro ito. Yaakov and all his progeny ito with him. Not finished. Now, it should be enough, right? All his progeny. Now we get much more specific. Bonov uvnei bonov ito. His sons and his grandsons ito. Benosov uvenos bonov. His daughters and the daughters of his sons. V'chol zaro. Again, hevi ito mitzrayim. How many times do we have to mention the word ito? What does this mean? Yaakov understood the only way that they're able to survive Egypt with all its influences and what it represents, they have to be ito. Unless they're under his guise, his supervision, and that literally secondary, that an adjunct to him, they're going to be compromised. He's made 130 years old. We're talking about his grandchildren. Let their parents deal with it. Every member of Yaakov's family came to Egypt. It was Ito. They were actually an adjunct to him. And as a result of that, that's the reason why, as long as he was alive, they were unscathed from whatever Egypt represented for that reason. That's Ito. Okay? Now, Yosef was the apple of the eye of Yaakov. And here the Torah tells us, when Yosef was told that his father's not well, immediately he understands what it's all about. The Yikach Eshnei Bonav Imo. Right? I mean, his sons seemingly should be Ito, correct? And here it says he took his two sons, Imo, Es Menashe, Es Ephraim, Es Menashe. They're the equivalent of himself. What's it about? He's taking the sons to receive a blessing. The reason why he's going is because of who his sons are. What was the bracha they received? Ephraim, Menashe, Keruvim, Shimon, Yeli. Although Ephraim and Menashe were grandchildren of Yaakov, they assumed the status of tribes. They themselves, Yosef was split in two. Although he's one son, he actually became two tribes. They in their own right had the capacity to be tribes. Therefore, it was Imo. They were the equivalent of himself. They weren't an adjunct to him. Therefore, he took his sons Imo with him, that they should be the equivalent of who he is. Because they had that capacity within themselves to be who they were. To assume the status of tribes, although they were grandchildren. Therefore, it's Imo, not Ito. The Yagid li Yaakov. Okay, until now, we're talking about Yisrael. It was told to Yaakov, V'yomahine bintcha Yosef bo yilecho. It was told to Yaakov, your son Yosef is coming to you. What does it say? Vayischazek Yisrael v'yeshev lamito. He strengthened himself because he wasn't well. He had to garner all his ability, and he sat up on the bed. But it's Yisrael. Now that he's sitting up erectly, what is he sitting up to? What is he about to do? He's acting within the capacity of Yisrael, as we'll see in a moment. So Yischazek Yisrael, next pasuk. V'yoma Yaakov el Yosef. Go back to Yaakov. Yaakov says to Yosef, Kel Shakai, Nirei Lai Beluz Beretz Kanon. Kel Shakai, he's using the appellation of Shakai, Shekol Chadai, meaning although God's ability is infinite, he's able to actually to control that. Like the Chazal say, when God said, let it be, it would have evolved forever. But he was able to rein in on that energy that it should be very precise and very specific. And what did he say to me? So Yaakov now is only reporting what Hashem had said to him. And what was that? He was Yaakov. I will cause you to be fruitful, increase, become numerous. I will make you into Kal Amim. That's two nations. We had earlier that each tribe was called an Am. So if you take a look in Dalan and Rashi, besides the Chazal, I was told that in the future I'm going to have another two tribes. Meaning ultimately there could be 13 tribes. Meaning 12 tribes received a portion of the land. Levi did not receive a portion of the land. So one of the tribes are going to be divided into two. Goy is Binyamin. He's one of the tribes. Kal Goyim Harishnayim. But in addition to Binyamin, there'll be another two. Levad mi Binyamin. V'shuv lo navli ben. And I had no other children. He only had Ephraim and Nash. He only had Yosef and Binyamin. So Binyamin's one. And so we're the other two. Lindeni she'osid ech b'shvotai lichodei. So that indicated, I understood, one of the tribes is supposed to be split in half. Are supposed to come two tribes. Vata osa matono, that gift that Hashem says one tribe is from two tribes, aninose loch. That gift I'm giving to you. That each of your children are going to assume the status of a tribe, although they're my grandchildren. That gift I'm giving to you. Okay? 1 second. Now the next pasuk, the information the Yaakov is communicating to Yosef so obvious, seems to be totally unnecessary. It's superfluous. Now your two sons that were born to you in Egypt, before I came to Egypt, they're equivalent of mine. They're equivalent of my children. Ephraim and Menashe, Reuven, Shimon, Eli. Therefore, Ephraim and Menashe will be the equivalent of Reuven and Shimon. What is he saying to Yosef? Your two children that were born to you before I came to Egypt, they were born to you. They're the equivalent of mine. And therefore, although they're yours, because they're equivalent of mine, therefore they will assume the status of Reuven and Shimon. I mean, we know what he has to. What does he have to say that? What is he's qualifying them? Now, why were Yaakov's children, despite the fact they were born in Choron, with this environment which was alien to anything of Kedusha, he was able to raise 11 of his 12 children there? Because as we said, Yaakov was able to create an insular environment that they should be unscathed whatever Choron was. Egypt was the same thing. How do you raise two sons like Ephraim and Menashe where they were not under the tutelage of Yaakov? Yaakov wasn't there. Yosef was there. Yosef being able to raise his children, although Yaakov was not there, that means Yosef is the equivalent of his father. He was able to create that similar insular environment to have Ephraim and Menashe, despite that they weren't yet under the tutelage and under the supervision of Yaakov. They weren't Ito. They're only Ito with Yosef, not with Yaakov. And because he was able to raise them, that's what he says, before I came to Egypt. Before I came, therefore those two sons are the equivalent of Ephraim and Menashe. Because we said Yosef was what? Was the equivalent of his father. Even though we find that when Yaakov passed away, the bondage started to the seepage started at some level. So he wasn't quite, but he was enough that he was able to raise children despite Yaakov not being there. Therefore, they had a capacity that they were equivalent of Reuven and Shimon for that reason. That's exactly what Yaakov was saying to Yosef. Reb Chaim Brisker, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik was the Rav in Brisk. And in those years, we're talking about before the Russian Revolution, what was going on in Europe, there were undercurrents of revolution and all kinds of isms, and people from the most observant family, and there was the Enlightenment movement in Europe, in Russia and Lithuania. As we know that in Germany and Hungary, there was the Reform movement, and in Russia and Lithuania, there was the Enlightenment movement. Children from the best families, they gave up their Judaism, totally. The isms became the religion. Communism, socialism, all these isms, that became their religion. They gave it all up. But it was known that before the Russian Revolution, they were what we call the Cantonists. What were the Cantonists? The Tsar realized, the Tsar was a rabid anti-Semite. And he realized that as much as he tries to force the Jews to accept Christianity, they're not accepting it. Not accepting it. Even if he sends them to the Gulag, threatens them, they're not giving up their Judaism. So what did he do? He started to conscript children from the age of 9 and 10, and he would take them away from their families, send them off to some far off place, and they'd start giving them this orientation of what, of whatever it is, of Christianity. And they were called cantons, these people. And what did they do? Every town in those years had a cheder. And they had certain people who were Jews, and they were worked for the government, for the czar. They would go into a cheder, a class where the children were 8, 9, 10 years old, and every town had to give so many children. And of course, the parents wouldn't be agreeable to give the children over because they understood what the result would be. So he would go into the cheder and he would kidnap the children. Outside of the school, there was a paddy wagon waiting with soldiers, and they take these kids and throw them into the paddy wagon, and they went to school. The parents never saw the children ever again. The people who were hired by the government, they were Jews. They were called chappers. They were called grabbers. They would grab the children. They were kidnappers. And there was the influence, the winds of atheism and all that were blowing very strongly in Europe. And most families were affected. Even the families that were not torn away through the Cantons were very seriously affected by all these outside influences. There was one family that, despite influences, they remained committed devoutly to Torah and mitzvahs. And they went to his Reb Chaim. Why did this family merit that their children should remain unscathed, protected? I mean, the father was no different than any other father. What was his chus? So Reb Chaim Brisker said, I'll tell you a story, that this man who raised his children, his father was a teacher of these 8, 10-year-old students. And one of these chappers, these kidnappers, come into the school, come into his class, and start grabbing these kids by their collar, dragging them out of the classroom. And these kids are kicking and screaming. They don't want to go because they understand where they're going. They will never see their parents again. And worse than that. And this chapper, this Jew, grabs this child, pulls him out. And as he grabs a hold of this kid by the neck, the Rebbe goes and he slaps this chapper across the face that his head nearly spins around. And as he does that, he drops the child, runs out. So Reb Chaim Brisker said, when he slapped that person, he took his life in his hands. Why? Because if he would have gone out and reported it to one of the soldiers who were guarding this paddy wagon, these children, he would have come in and shot that Rebbe dead. But despite that, the Rebbe didn't take that in consideration. So he said, in the merit of that patch, he used the word patch, slap in Yiddish. In the merit of that patch, that's the reason why these children are still committed, devout to Torah mitzvahs. That's what Reb Chaim said. So there, it wasn't that the father was so special that he had this ability of influence. His family merited this divine protection in the schus of the patch, of that slap. Yaakov Avinu was able to create an aura which created the insular environment. Yosef had that same ability. And that's what he said. The 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were born to you before I came to Egypt. They are who they are. Therefore, they are the equivalent of Reuben and Shimon. Ephraim and Manasseh are the equivalent of that. That's why they qualify.